is canceled for this afternoon after school. So parents have been notified, but if you feel like you need to check in with the parents, please ask your teacher for a convenient time to come to the office to make a phone call for a transportation change. Again, art club is canceled after school. Thank you.
Was there anyone planning on staying after for art club? Perfect. So page 85, the springtime. So on the back of our comprehension page, we've already done the autumn and winter. Today we are doing spring and summer, and we're going to be finishing the rest of the backside. Remember, there are 2 bullets in each of these boxes. So to get the points when we correct our comprehension page, you need to have 2 main activities for that season. But remember, we are using this comprehension page to help us study for the test. So if you want to add more to it, definitely add more. It's only going to help you when you study for our test that is next week. Okay, so let's listen to what they were doing in the spring at the trading post.
Spring. As the weather turned warmer, John Sayer carefully counted the number of beaver pelts brought to him by his Ojibwe trading partners. By the time he left the Snake River post in late April, he had hundreds of pelts. He hoped that the other owners of the Northwest Company would be happy with his haul. 4 weeks after leaving the Snake River, Sayer and his party arrived at Fort William. This was a large Northwest Company trading center north of Grand Portage in what is now Canada. Séraphin Lamar did his best to keep his boss happy, but he did not always succeed. When he returned from a visit to the Ojibwe with no beaver pelts, Sayer scolded Lamar for not getting enough furs in his trades with the Ojibwe. Joseph Girard and the other voyageurs worked hard during their last weeks at the fort. They netted fish and hunted ducks. They took the canoes out of storage and repaired them. They packaged the beaver pelts into bundles that would make them easier to load and unload. Finally, they said goodbye to their wives and children and launched their canoes on the long journey to Fort William. Sometimes the voyageurs returned to their Ojibwe families the next year. Sometimes they never came back. Monceau Manayin and many of the other Ojibwe men continued to hunt beavers even as Sayer and his men prepared to depart. Some Ojibwe turned their attention to the making and repairing of canoes.
Lots going on in the spring. Remember, in the winter time, they're more spread out. It's winter weather. They're not traveling as much. They're kind of hunkered down, taking care of their stuff. The Ojibwe were doing their hunting, getting the beaver pelts. So in the spring, when they're able to travel more because the weather's better, there's not as much snow on the ground, they're able to get to the trading post, so they're doing their trading. But it's not just trading happening in the spring. Just like when they went to the maple sugar camps, it wasn't just maple sugar camps happening. There's more things happening in the springtime than just trading. They're having to pack up all of the pelts that were traded. They're having to repair their canoes. They're having to do some hunting. They're hunting for the ducks that are coming back up north, right? So there's a lot happening in the springtime.
In early March, the Ojibwe women left for the sugar camps to collect sap and make maple sugar. In April, the leaders of most Ojibwe bands made their final visits to the fort. There, they delivered their beaver pelts to pay what they owed to the company or buy more goods if they had extra. They also received gifts of medals, ammunition, and tobacco from Sayer. The medals were symbols of a trading partnership that they hoped to renew in the fall.
So we know from our Ojibwe year that they're going to the sugar camps. That was, remember, the women that did the packing up and the moving of stuff. So while the women are packing up, moving to the sugar camps and getting the sugar camps running, the men are taking all of those pelts that they had gotten over the winter and they're bringing them to the trading posts. So everybody has their job to do. Big thing for the men was to bring them to the trading post while the women were busy doing their thing. Now let's look at the summertime.
Summer. Each year, the trading cycle ended with an event called the Rendezvous. This gathering of people involved in the fur trade lasted for weeks. For many years, the rendezvous happened at Grand Portage on Lake Superior. By 1805, it had moved farther up the lake to Fort William.
So the rendezvous is huge, right? They've gotten all of those pelts, they've traded for them, they've gotten hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pelts that they need to now get where? They've got all the pelts here in Minnesota. Where do these pelts need to end up? Eleanor? Europe. Those are the people that want them, that they're going to pay for them. So we need to get them from Minnesota to Europe. Where do you think they're going to go to in Minnesota to get them ready to go to Europe? Adeline? Good guess. But instead of taking the Mississippi all the way down south to the Gulf of Mexico and then having to go all the way over to Europe, that's going to take a long time. There's a different way that they're going to go. Robbie?
Through the Great Lakes?
Yeah, through the Great Lakes. So instead of going all the way south on the Mississippi and then going up and over to Europe, they're just going to go across the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean to go over to Europe. Where's the best place for them to get started on that journey? Rocco? Yeah, and what big town? Yeah, they're going to go to that Duluth area of Lake Superior. Think about, they still use that waterway now. When you go up to Duluth, you see the big ships coming in, right? It started way back here. They were loading up those big ships to take the pelts over to Europe, right? We still use that same waterway with those big cargo ships now. But it started hundreds of years ago with the fur trade.
Hundreds of traders, clerks, voyageurs, and native people gathered for the rendezvous each June. They brought with them thousands of tons of pelts. During the weeks that followed, workers counted, repacked, and loaded the pelts for the trip through the Great Lakes to Montreal. From there, sailing ships would carry the pelts across the Atlantic Ocean to London, Paris, and other European cities. At the same time, huge canoes arrived from Montreal, carrying tons of manufactured goods. As the boats were unloaded, traders collected the goods they had ordered for the coming season. Before long, voyageurs would make the journey to bring these goods to the wintering posts, where the cycle of trading would begin again.
So remember, there's all those trading posts throughout Minnesota. They're all headed to the big rendezvous at Fort Williams. So they're all converging onto Fort Williams. Also coming into Fort Williams is the trade goods that the American Indians want to trade for. So they're bringing the pelts there to send the pelts out to Europe, and coming in are the trade goods that their voyageurs are now going to bring to the trading posts, because that's what they need to trade with the American Indians. So the rendezvous was huge, lots of people coming in, huge big activity. But even in that big activity, there were a lot of small activities that happened that are important. So it's not just, oh, there's a rendezvous, we all get together. They're preparing the pelts, they're counting the pelts, they're making sure the pelts are loaded up and ready for travel. They're making sure the trade goods get unpacked and get out to the trading posts. So there's lots of things happening at the rendezvous that you can write about. It's not just, oh, they had the rendezvous, that's it. There's lots of things happening at that rendezvous. Okay, I'm going to come back to the coming changes. So we've gone through autumn, winter, spring, and summer. Now we're going to backtrack up to that blue box that has the workers of the fur trade. I think, was it page 83?
Yeah.
Page 83. So let's learn about these workers of the fur trade. Some of these are key terms. So we've already been talking about them. There are some new ones. So we're going to have to make note of those. remember that when we are using our comprehension page, if it's something that's not being asked on here, but it's a job in the fur trade, do you think we still need to know about it? Yeah, I see a lot of us shaking our heads, yes, we still need to know it, right? So if it was me, I would make little notes on here, adding the couple of jobs that aren't on here, so I remember that it's important for me to know for the test next week. You're not being graded on it, but you are on the test. So not everything on the test is just from the comprehension page. We still need to know everything from the chapter. So we can see that our table is split up into Europeans and American Indians. They had different roles in the fur trade. For the Europeans, they were the traders, the clerks, the voyageurs. Okay, so in those boxes, you're going to say what the main roles of those jobs are. The American Indians are the hunters, the pelt preparer, ooh, that's a new one, and interpreter. We're going to see what other jobs we might need to add to there also. So let's learn about these jobs.
Workers of the fur trade. The fur trade relied on the hard work of both Europeans and American Indians. Hundreds of people filled various roles. Traders and clerks were usually European, and voyageurs were typically European or mixed race. The trade depended on American Indians to be the hunters, pelt preparers, suppliers, guides, and interpreters. The trader, also known as a wintering partner, was in charge of one or more trading posts. The more furs he collected, the more money he made. The trader could read and write and often came from a wealthy family. His high social position gave him privileges that no one else at the trading post had. Partners often traveled from post to post over the winter to oversee the progress of their workers. The clerk worked under the partner. Sometimes he was put in charge of an entire trading post. Sometimes he just managed the day-to-day business at the post, keeping accounts, supervising trade, and packing pelts. Like the partner, the clerk could read and write, but he didn't hold the same high social position as the trader. Clerks were often young men who dreamed of becoming partners themselves. The voyageurs were the ordinary workmen of the fur trade, spending much of their time on the water or in the woods. They paddled canoes and hauled heavy loads on their back for low pay. Their job required strength and...
Oops, sorry. I didn't mean to click that yet. So the voyageurs' jobs required strength and endurance. Most voyageurs were French Canadian. Few could read or write. So their human capital wasn't in their education, being able to read and write and do math and run the fur trade business, but their human capital was in their strength. They were having to haul all of these goods all over the place. They had to be really strong. Then we have the American Indian jobs. So we have the hunters. They were usually Dakota and Ojibwe men. We know the men were the hunters. Whereas with the Europeans, it was all men. The women stayed in Europe, right? It was the European men who came over for the fur trade. For the American Indians, some of these jobs are men and some of the jobs were women. The hunters were the men. And they used those metal traps. They wanted to hunt in the wintertime, so they had the thickest fur. The pelt preparers. This is a new one. It's not a key term, but it's important to know. The pelt preparer readied the furs for trade. They were usually the Dakota women, Dakota and Ojibwe women. They had to prepare the pelt. That means they had to cut the skin off of the animal. They turned it inside out to protect all of that fur that was still on it, because that was the important part. That's what the fur traders wanted. That's what the hat makers wanted in Europe. So in preparing that pelt, they were having to protect all of that fur. The suppliers, this is a new word. It's not a key term that we have, and it's not in the box, but it's important to know. Okay, So you need to know who the suppliers are. That was the Dakota and the Ojibwe. You might want to write this at the bottom of the box, at the bottom of the table, because you still need to know about this job. The suppliers provided goods the Europeans needed to survive the winter. They provided clothing and food, like meat and wild rice and moccasins. Sometimes they were providing canoes, because they've used canoes for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They know how to repair them. Okay, so they were able to help the fur traders with those. Some Ojibwe and Dakota acted as guides for the Europeans. They were familiar with the landscape. They helped them find their ways through the woods, right? Guides could be either men or women. Okay, we've all heard of Sacagawea. She was an American Indian guide, right? So the women could be those guides because they're moving around the woods just as much as the men are. The interpreter is another role played by the Dakota and Ojibwe. Interpreters knew the native and European languages and helped the traders talk and negotiate with many Ojibwe and Dakota that they met along the way. Could be men or women, right? They were both learning all of those languages. All right. Even though we hear a lot about the men that were involved in the fur trade, the women still played a big role. The women were still important, but it's the men were the ones that were talking about what was happening. The ones saying, hey, this is what we're doing at the fur trade. The Ojibwe and Dakota women were just doing their jobs. Okay, they weren't making big journal entries. Nothing is reflecting back to them. But just know that the American Indian women had big roles in the fur trade. They were the pelt preparers. They were interpreters. They were marrying into the fur trade business, right? So they could have those relationships. So big stuff that the women still did. Now let's look at the human capital. That green box, I think, is at page 85? 87. So that green box, human capital and profit. So that's number 10 on the comprehension page. Who can remind us what is human capital? Eleanor.
It raises your money amount depending on your skill and experience of that job.
Your knowledge and skills. The more knowledge and skill that you get, the more that you get paid. It could be paid with goods, could be paid with money. Okay, so you're getting a higher pay with the more that you know. So let's see how that relates to the fur trade.
Human capital and profit. To succeed in the fur trade, the Dakota and the Ojibwe developed their human capital, their skills and abilities. One way they did this was to display values important to them, such as community and generosity. These values influenced their interactions with European traders. The Europeans who traded with the Ojibwe and Dakota also developed their human capital, but their goal was different. The clerks, traders, and voyageurs involved in the fur trade developed their human capital in order to help their company make a profit and to increase the wages they earned. Traders might increase their human capital by learning to speak multiple languages so they could better communicate with their Dakota and Ojibwe trading partners. A voyageur might work to become strong and stay healthy so he could transport more furs. Those who did not develop their human capital didn't have as much earning potential as those who did. Imagine you are Sarah Fenn Lamar, and you have just been criticized by your boss, Mr. Sayer, for your stinky negotiation skills. What could you do to develop your human capital related to negotiating?
So if we look at number 10, it says, if someone involved in the fur trade did not work to increase his or her human capital, what might happen as a result? Any of the jobs in the fur trade, they all need to increase their human capital so they can get more of what they want. So what's going to happen if they're not increasing their human capital? What might happen to them? We're not going to say the answer out loud. You're gonna write down what might happen if somebody involved in the fur trade was not trying to increase their human capital. What might happen? Adeline?
So you write about what might happen to the European or the Native American.
Anyone involved in the fur trade, okay? All right, so our last section, the coming changes. Okay, because we know the fur trade doesn't go on forever. We're not still involved in the fur trade. It will come to an end. There will be changes happening. So number 11 says by the early 1800s, what kinds of new tools and ways of life were replacing traditional ways for the Dakota and the Ojibwe? We think about 100 years ago from right now, was life the same as it is now? No, it's very different. Okay, if we think about what a phone was like 100 years ago, it's not like a cell phone, a smartphone now, where you can look up whatever you want, you have everything at the tip of your fingers. The first phones that came out were very, very different. Would we be able to survive like with something from 100 years ago? We would miss the technology we have now. It's the same thing for the Dakota and the Ojibwe. That technology, they were getting new stuff with those trade goods. They're getting new things. They're getting new technology. They're not going to want to go back to what life was like 100 years ago. So we're going to look at what kind of things were replacing their old way of life, what the new way of life is like. So let's listen to this.
Coming changes. The European traders, along with their American Indian suppliers, all belonged to a vast trading network that took only a few decades to develop. Native people caught the animals, prepared the furs, and sold them to the Europeans. The Europeans and American Indians bargained with each other to get the best deals possible. The voyageurs paddled hundreds of miles, carrying trade goods and pelts back and forth between the trading posts and the big settlements, such as Montreal. For more than 100 years, the fur trade brought new, useful goods to the Dakota and Ojibwe people, but at a cost. By the 1800s, these new manufactured goods began to replace traditional tools. Steel axes were durable, and it was easier to trap furs to trade for a metal axe than it was to make a stone axe. Over time, the Dakota and Ojibwe relied more and more on the goods provided by the French and the British. Skills such as making axes from stone became less important. New ways of living were replacing ways that had been successful for centuries. By 1804, when Sayre set up his post on the Snake River, the fur trade with the British was entering its final years. After the War of 1812 ended, only U.S. citizens were allowed to trade in this area. By 1825, the American Fur Company would take control of the fur trade in this region. If the British and French wanted to keep trading here, they would have to become U.S. citizens. It was one of the first signs that this new nation, which had formed in lands to the east, was now looking west to the lands of the Dakota and the Ojibwe.
So, things are changing, right? They're getting these new trade goods. So now that fur trade lasted for a couple hundred years, they no longer know what they knew 200 years ago because those skills were dying off because they were able to trade for things instead of making it themselves. So write down what things were changing. This comprehension page is due by Friday, so make sure that if you don't have it done, bring your book home to work on for homework. Today was due the History Day contract. Make sure, you know what, I'm going to sign off on this because this is it for what we're going over here. So if you are watching this at home, remember this is being recorded, friends. So if you're watching at home, I hope you're well and hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day. If you have